Tessa had always loved the mountains. The smell of pine, the endless stretches of trails, and the quiet. It all felt like home. She'd been hiking the Cascades for years, but today, something felt different. It was late spring. The wildflowers were blooming and the sun was high, but her feet dragged a little more than usual. She was near the peak of North Ridge Trail when she saw it. A movement at the edge of the path caught her eye. Something moving with the quiet grace of the wild. At first she thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear, but as the figure came into view, she realized it was a bobcat. Its tawny coat blended perfectly with the forest backdrop, the only clear difference being the strange object it was carrying in its mouth. Tessa's heart skipped a beat. The bobcat's movements were deliberate, but there was something almost protective about how it carried the bundle, its head low, its eyes darting nervously between the trail and the forest. Tessa's instincts told her not to approach. She paused, barely breathing, watching the creature move. The bobcat trotted past, unaware of her presence, its fur rippling as it moved swiftly through the underbrush. Tessa squinted, her curiosity piqued. The object was unusual. It was too large to be a typical piece of prey. The bobcat's jaw clutched it tightly, but it looked soft, almost too soft. It wasn't until the bobcat disappeared into the trees that Tessa's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the bundle clearly enough now. It was a small, lifeless thing. A baby animal, maybe a fawn or a small rabbit. But it wasn't just that. It was the way the bobcat moved, the way it carried the tiny body with such care, that sent a chill down her spine. Tessa stood frozen for a long moment. The image of that bobcat, its quiet determination, stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Something was wrong, she could feel it. Like a tug on her heart she couldn't explain. And yet she couldn't shake the thought of the bobcat's strange burden, nor could she ignore the inexplicable urge that was pulling her toward the woods. Tessa's feet moved almost instinctively, her body drawn to the spot where the bobcat had disappeared into the trees. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of birds calling and leaves rustling in the soft breeze. Yet despite the natural beauty surrounding her, an uneasy feeling settled deep in her chest. She shouldn't be following the bobcat. It was a wild animal after all, and she had no business disturbing it. But something about the way it had carried that small, fragile body made her feel like she couldn't turn away. She had to see what was going on. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "It's just a wild animal, Tessa. It'll be fine," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. The bobcat had acted strangely protective, not at all like the solitary predators she knew them to be. That strange, careful way it had carried its burden tugged at her like an unanswered question. The forest grew denser the further she moved. The path had vanished under the dense undergrowth, but Tessa didn't care. She moved quietly, following the faint paw prints left behind on the damp earth. She had no idea where this would lead her, but the thought of leaving now, not knowing the truth behind what she had seen, felt unbearable. Her shoes crunched softly on the twigs beneath. Her feet and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot felt too loud in the quiet woods. She moved slowly, listening to the sound of the breeze swishing through the trees, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to catch up with something it already knew. Minutes passed, and Tessa's resolve began to waver. Her legs ached from the constant movement, and the shadows of the trees were growing longer as the afternoon wore on. The sun's rays barely pierced the thick canopy above, casting everything in a dim, greenish hue. She stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat from her forehead, her heart racing. She was beginning to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing, if perhaps the bobcat had been something she'd conjured in her mind. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard it, the softest of sounds, a low, faint whimper. It wasn't a cry of distress or pain. It was something softer, quieter, a sound that, strangely, didn't belong in the forest. Her heart skipped. A beat. She held her breath, listening intently. There it was again. The sound came from ahead of her, and without thinking, she moved forward, more determined than ever to find its source. The track she had been following grew more pronounced now, and in the distance she saw the bobcat once again, crouched low in a small clearing, its back to her, the tiny body still clutched in its jaws. The bobcat had stopped moving, its tail twitching nervously as it stared into the brush. Tessa felt her heart tighten in her chest. What was it doing? The bundle it carried was now visible, its tiny form limp and still. But something was wrong. The bobcat didn't seem to be hunting or scavenging. It wasn't in attack mode or looking for food. It was protecting the small body. Tessa's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The bobcat wasn't carrying prey. It was carrying something it had lost. Tessa's legs felt like lead as she slowly moved toward the bobcat, keeping a safe distance. Careful. Not to startle it. She crouched low, eyes locked on the creature, unable to look away. The bobcat was tense, its tail flicking back and forth as it shifted slightly, its protective stance clear. It hadn't seen her yet, but the way it held the bundle in its mouth, so gently and yet with such fierce attention, was something she couldn't ignore. The body it carried wasn't a typical kill. It wasn't even alive. The weight of that truth settled over Tessa like a cold fog. The bobcat wasn't just protecting a piece of prey. It was guarding the lifeless form of its own kitten. Her heart ached. She felt a lump form in her throat. As the realization hit her fully, this wasn't just an animal's instinct to survive. This was grief. The small, motionless form in the bobcat's jaws was unmistakable now. A baby bobcat. Tessa's stomach twisted as she took in the fragile little creature. Still a kitten, its eyes closed and its body limp. Her breath caught in her throat. How had this happened? Why was the mother carrying it like this, so carefully, with such tenderness? She watched as the bobcat set the tiny body down gently in the clearing. It nudged it with its nose as if trying to wake it, but the kitten didn't stir. The bobcat gave a mournful, low growl, a sound of frustration and loss. It pawed at the small body, then stepped back, looking over its shoulder at the woods, as if waiting for something, someone, to appear. Its head swung back to the body, and Tessa could see it, the unmistakable grief in its eyes. A mother, lost in sorrow. Tessa's heart broke for the bobcat. The wild could be merciless, but this was different. It was more than just survival. The bobcat wasn't abandoning its young. It was mourning. Something about the scene felt intimate, like she had stepped into a private moment she shouldn't have seen. For a long moment, Tessa stayed frozen, watching the bobcat and the lifeless kitten. The mother circled around the body, nudging it, again with a quiet sound of distress. The air around them seemed to still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Tessa wanted to reach out, to comfort, to do something, but she knew that was impossible. She was just an observer, a stranger, in this wild moment. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the bobcat lifted the body back into its jaws. It hesitated for just a moment, its gaze flicking to Tessa, locking eyes with her. The sadness in those golden eyes was more than she could bear, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them, an understanding. The wild could be brutal, but the love a mother had for her child, even in the face of death, transcended everything. The bobcat turned and began to move back into the underbrush, its steps slow and deliberate. It wasn't running away. It wasn't fleeing. It was simply leaving, carrying its lost child with a fierce determination that Tessa knew could never be undone. She stood there, motionless, as the creature disappeared into the woods, her heart heavy with a sadness she couldn't explain. The forest once again fell silent. Tessa stood in the clearing, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of what she had just witnessed settling deep in her chest. She had come here seeking peace, seeking something to clear her mind, but what she had found, the raw grief of a mother losing her young, was far more profound, far more haunting than she could have ever imagined. The bobcat had carried its dead kitten away with such quiet strength, such undeniable love that Tessa found herself frozen in place, unable to move, unable to shake the image from her mind. For a long while, she stood there, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, the birds overhead chattering like they were unaware of the heartbreak that had just unfolded in their midst. Tessa couldn't seem to find the strength to leave. Her feet felt anchored to the earth, as though the forest itself was holding her in place, forcing her to face the emotions swirling inside her. The truth was, she hadn't just witnessed the bobcat's grief. She had felt it too. There was something so universal in the way the mother had carried her kitten, the tenderness in her movements despite the harshness of the world around her. It wasn't just an animal instinct. It was a love so pure, so raw, that it transcended everything else, even death. Tessa turned slowly and began walking in the direction the bobcat had gone, the urge to follow her deeper now. There was no reasoning with it, no rational explanation, for why she felt compelled to trace the path of this grieving mother. Maybe it was her own lingering sense of loss that made her feel so connected to the bobcat. After all, hadn't she too been carrying something heavy inside her? A weight she hadn't yet let go of, a grief she had never fully processed? She found herself moving faster, her steps growing more determined as she followed the trail. The forest seemed quieter now, as if it too was respecting the solemnity of the moment. The scent of pine filled the air, and the underbrush seemed to part for her as she moved. Tessa didn't know how far she had walked, or how long she had been following the bobcat's path, but as she neared the edge of the trees, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in a small clearing bathed in dappled sunlight, the bobcat had stopped again. The kitten's body was laid gently on the ground, surrounded by a circle of stones, the earth soft and undisturbed. The bobcat had created a grave, a resting place for her lost child. It was as though the creature knew, instinctively, how to honor its young, how to give it a peaceful resting place in the heart of the forest. Tessa's throat tightened, and the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilled over. She sank to her knees, her chest heaving with emotion. She wasn't sure what she was crying for. Maybe it was for the bobcat, for the loss she had witnessed. Maybe it was for herself, for the sorrow she hadn't known how to release until now. But in that moment, as she looked at the tiny grave, she understood something about the connection between all living things, how grief, love, and loss could bind them together in ways that words could never capture. The bobcat turned and, with a final glance at her dead kitten, disappeared back into the forest, leaving Tessa alone with her thoughts. The wind rustled through the trees and the birds resumed their songs. The forest was alive again, but for Tessa, it was no longer just a place of quiet retreat. It had become a place of understanding, of shared sorrow and unspoken connection. She slowly rose to her feet, wiping her eyes, and made her way back toward the trail. The image of the bobcat's grief, the love it had shown for its young, would stay with her long after she left the forest. Tessa walked slowly back toward the trail, her steps heavy, the weight of what she had witnessed still pressing down on her chest. The mountain trail, once a place of comfort, now felt unfamiliar, almost alien. She was no longer just a hiker lost in the beauty of the wilderness. The forest, with its quiet secrets, had shared something with her, a rawness, a vulnerability she hadn't known she could understand. The grief of the bobcat, the way she had tenderly carried her lifeless kitten, had opened something deep within Tessa. She had never expected to feel such an overwhelming connection to an animal, to see that kind of pain, that kind of love, and realize how little it had to do with species or survival. It was the universal language of loss. It was something every living thing could understand. As she made her way down the trail, her eyes were dry now, but the quiet tears from earlier still felt fresh. She didn't know why it had affected her so deeply. She hadn't cried like that in years. The weight of her own unresolved grief, the losses she had never fully dealt with, they came rushing to the surface, tangled up with the sorrow she had seen in the bobcat. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tessa allowed herself to feel it all. The pain, the regret, the unspoken hurt that had been sitting inside her for so long. By the time she reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The forest was bathed in golden light, the shadows long and soft. Tessa paused for a moment at the edge of the woods, taking in the view, the way the fading light made everything look almost surreal, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the day to end. She had come here seeking peace, but what she had found was something far more complicated. She had found an understanding of life's fragility, how something so small and vulnerable could matter so much. And in witnessing that, she had also found a piece of herself that had been missing for a long time. Tessa stood there for a long, while watching as the last light of day disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the forest in a quiet, peaceful darkness. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt a sense of calm, not the kind that came from escaping the world, but the kind that came from accepting it. The sorrow, and the joy, the love, and the loss all tangled together. She knew she would carry this moment with her forever. The image of the bobcat, its grief, its love, its loss, it would stay with her as a reminder of what it meant to be human, what it meant to be alive. And as she walked away from the forest, heading back toward her car, Tessa understood something profound. Sometimes in the quietest corners of the world, you can find a piece of yourself that you never even knew was lost.